Zodiacs.
Modus Operandi.
This video on the Zodiac killer is in two parts. The first part covers the 4 crimes that we know that he committed, and then the second part is the Zodiac's MO and a discussion about it. All the photographs are of the actual people, and all of the pictures and video of houses and the crime scenes have recently been obtained. Here's a modern look at crime scene number 1 in the Zodiac murders. Unfortunately, David Faraday and his date, Betty Lou Jensen, lost their lives when they parked on the side of the road in a turnout that night. James Owen passed by in his car at 11:10 p.m. and noticed 2 cars in the turnout. 1, the station wagon, and 2, another vehicle that he couldn't remember exactly what it looked like. Stella, her daughter Michelle, and her mother-in-law passed the site at 11:15. She was on her way to pick up her son Danny, 13 years old, from the movie theater in Benicia, California, when she noticed a young man lying on the ground, and then she noticed a young woman lying on the ground, and she raced off towards Benicia to get help. When she got down to Benicia, she noticed a patrol car with Officer Daniel Pitta and William T. Warner inside, and she told them what she saw, and they headed off to Lake Herman Road. And Benicia officers Pitta and Warner arrived at the crime scene at 11:24 p.m. and they found David Faraday suffering from a gunshot wound to the head, but he was still breathing. And they found Betty Lou Jensen several feet behind the vehicle, lying on her side. Then several people arrived at the crime scene. A Benicia police sergeant, a reporter for the Daily Republic, and then the Solano County Sheriff. Betty Lou had been shot 5 times in the back in a remarkable close pattern. 3 of the bullets had emerged from her front. Betty Lou's dress had no smoke or gunpowder residue in one hole in the center front, nor was there any tattooing in the 5 punctures in the upper right side of her back. However, in the topmost hole in back, a single grain of gunpowder was discovered. That meant that all of the slugs that struck her, only one was fired at a closer range. The first stop after David picked up Betty Lou at her house was Sharon's house, and they got there at 8:20 and they stayed there until 9 p.m. And then they left and went to a play at Hogan High School, and after the play was over, they went to Mr. Ed's drive-in, and then from there they went out to Lake Herman Road and parked. Now Bingo Wessner was finishing up his job watching some livestock, and so at 10 p.m. he exited through that gate, and David and Betty's car was not there at that time, but there was another white Chevy sedan parked there, and he noticed a red truck over by the driveway to Marshall Ranch, and then he left and went home. Now Peggy Yore and her husband were in Sacramento, and they were driving south to Benicia, where their home was. But her husband wanted to look at some construction that his company was doing. So they exited Lake Herman Road and drove west. And about 11 o'clock, they saw David and Betty in their car in the station wagon. And then they continued past and turned right, where they were confronted by two raccoon hunters, Frank Gasser and Robert Connelly. And they spoke, and then Peggy told her husband that one of the men had a gun and let's get out of here. And so they turned around and then went left on Lake Herman Road, east, and drove by David and Betty again and saw them there a few minutes after 11 p.m. The police questioned Robert Connelly. He states that he went to the Gasser Ranch at approximately 6 p.m. They sat around a while and didn't leave until several hours later. They arrived in the area of the pump station around 9 p.m. They parked the car about 25 feet inside of the Marshall Ranch property off of the road. They walked the creek towards the pump station. They had the dogs loose, and they treed either a cat or a raccoon in the area of the Dada Ranch. While they were there, they saw some sort of activity up there. All the lights were on, but they were a little distance away and couldn't tell what the activity was. Robert states that approximately 5 minutes later, they drove in his truck and they passed the car. Robert insists that the Rambler was parked on the bank. That would be on the south side. He did not see any person in the car. He estimated he left the area between 11 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. He was asked about a rifle. He suggested that we call or see a gentleman by the name of Ralph Harlan Hall, who lives in Vallejo. Here's a modern look at crime scene number 2, where Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mayhew were shot by the Zodiac killer, and Darlene passed away from her injuries. Vallejo police officer Richard Hoffman was at the park prior to Michael and Darlene arriving there, and he found the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs clear of people or other vehicles. At approximately 12:10, he received a radio message of 2 teenagers being shot in the area of Blue Rock Springs Park, and he was the first police officer to arrive there. Now another police officer rushing to the scene of the crime came across a Cadillac driving very slow away from the crime scene. Andrew and Betty Sue, and this was back in the day, and they were arrested immediately and taken to the police station. Now backtracking on our story. Darlene Ferrin, who was married to Dean Ferrin, who had a little girl, went out for the 4th of July to celebrate with her younger sister. And after Darlene dropped her sister off, she got home around 11 p.m. Now the babysitter, Pamela Hansen, who was a friend of Darlene's sister, had company with her, Janet Rhodes, and that was the daughter of one of Darlene's friends from work. Now at this moment, Dean Ferrin was about to close up the restaurant, and he invited several of his friends to a party at his house, and they were going to have some fireworks. So Dean asked his boss to call Darlene and tell her to get some fireworks. And so he did that. He called. And at that moment, Darlene was about to take the two girls home. However, she decided to change her plans, and she asked the girls if they wouldn't mind staying another hour or so she could go out and get fireworks. However, she had planned to do something with Michael that night, and so she wanted to go by there and speak to him, and then get the fireworks and return. So Darlene drove directly over to Michael's house, which was 1.5 miles away from her house. Then they decided to go to Mr. Ed's drive-in, which was 0.8 miles from Michael's house. But when they arrived at the restaurant, Darlene decided that she didn't want to go there, and so she turned around and headed east on Springs Road out to Blue Rock Springs Park. And they parked out there and started talking, and that's when the Zodiac killer pulled up behind them. And he got out with a flashlight, went to the passenger side of the vehicle, and shot Darlene and Michael multiple times. Now the groundskeeper's son, George Ronald Bryant, age 22, heard the gunfire and called the police department to report it. Here's some information on the groundskeeper. And he was only 5 foot 2 inches tall, so he wasn't the Zodiac. Then sometime later, Jerry Weathers, Deborah, and Roger drove into Blue Rock Springs Park and saw Michael lying on the ground, and they spoke to him, and he told them to go to get help, that he was dying. And so they drove to Jerry's house, which was 1.6 miles away, and called the police to report the shooting. And they spoke to Nancy Slover at 12:10 a.m., July 5th. Then, 30 minutes later, at 12:40 a.m., the Zodiac called the police department, and Nancy Slover answered the telephone. And he reported a double murder, and then he hung up the phone, but it was an emergency number, and the phone rang, which startled him. And he picked it up, and then he just left it. On July 31st, 1969, the Zodiac mailed 3 letters from San Francisco to 3 newspapers: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. The San Francisco Chronicle opened their copy of the letter sometime Friday morning. The letter claims responsibility for the murder of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and the murder of Darlene Ferrin on July 4th. And it threatens to go on a kill spree that night, Friday night, if his letter is not published in the newspaper. The San Francisco Chronicle published their cipher, the middle part, on Saturday morning. And then, once they got a copy of all 3 ciphers, they published that on Sunday morning in their Sunday edition. That had a very large circulation. Now, at the end of the news article, the Vallejo police chief questioned the letter writer that he didn't believe that he was the man who shot David, Betty, Darlene, and Michael. And he asked the writer of the letters and the cipher to provide more details about the crimes. And the Zodiac wrote back to the newspaper with the infamous start, "This is the Zodiac speaking." And he went on to give more details about how he committed the murders, and that he used a small flashlight, attached to his gun to help him with his aim in the darkness. Now, a few days before this, Donald Hardin and his wife solved the Zodiac's 3-part cipher, and they called the newspaper to tell them. And the newspaper asked that he mail the solution to them. And so they received the solution on August 8th, 1969. And here it is here. And also here it is from the police report. And for some reason they're not exactly the same. Here's a modern look at crime scene number 3 at Lake Berryessa, where the Zodiac killer tied up and stabbed Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, and Cecilia Shepard passed away from her injuries. Brian and Cecilia decided to go to San Francisco, but it was getting late that afternoon, and so they decided instead to go to Lake Berryessa. And they arrived there around 4 p.m. that afternoon. Then, an hour or two later, a man with a hood over his face and an automatic pistol in his hand came towards them. The hooded man said he was an ex-con from Colorado and wanted a car and money. Hartnell said he only had 75 cents, but he did have a car, and he gave the man the keys for his car and told him it was up on the road. The man said, "I have to tie you up first." He had some plastic clothesline cut into 6-foot strips, which he tied them up with their hands between their backs and then their legs. Then the man said, "I'm going to have to stab you people. Please stab me first. I'm chicken. I couldn't stand to see the girl stabbed." The man told him, "I'll do just that." He stabbed Hartnell. He pretended to be dead, and the suspect went over to Shepard and stabbed Miss Shepard repeatedly in the back. And when Shepard turned over, the suspect stabbed her in the stomach. Brian said the suspect stabbed Cecilia much worse than him. He went into some sort of frenzy when he was stabbing Cecilia. Then the Zodiac killer walked to Brian Hartnell's car on the side of the road about a quarter mile from the lakeside, and he wrote in black felt pen what you see here, the dates of the 3 murders, even including the time of this murder, 6:30. Then the Zodiac killer got in his car and drove from Lake Berryessa to downtown Napa, which is about a 40-minute drive. And he went to a payphone, this telephone right here, and called and reported his crime and the location where they were, about 2 miles north of park headquarters. Today, the car wash has been replaced with a parking lot, but an interesting fact is there's a little bridge that goes over the creek, and so the Zodiac could have parked back there on a street and crossed the bridge to get to the payphone. And the telephone is up by the road, and looking out at the road, it would have been on the left side there. Now, when the Napa County Sheriff's detectives went out there to investigate the crime that night, they knew they were dealing with the Zodiac killer when they saw the writing on Brian Hartnell's passenger car door. And they also learned that the Zodiac had parked directly behind Hartnell's car, and 2 of the tires were worn, and of different sizes. And they found one of Zodiac's shoe prints on the ground about halfway between the cars and the lakeside. They were men's size 10.5 military shoes, and they were a special type of boot, a wing walker from either the Air Force or the Navy. Now, prior to Brian and Cecilia getting to the lake, 3 female students from Pacific Union College, Linda Johnston, Linda Jensen, and Joanne Chase, told a story to the police that a man in a car described as a light blue or silver Chevy, California tags, seemed to be watching them that afternoon. When they parked at a gas station, he parked next to them and just sat in his car smoking cigarettes. This was shortly before 3 p.m. And then about 4 p.m., they were sunbathing at the lake when they were spotted by the same guy looking at them. They described him as tall, 6 feet, 200 to 230 pounds, mid-20s to mid-30s, with straight, dark hair worn with a side part. He looked clean cut, wearing a black sweatshirt with short sleeves and dark blue slacks. Now on this map, the yellow circle is where the girls first saw the mystery man. The blue rectangle is where park headquarters were. And then the red oval is the crime scene and where the girls saw the man again. And then at the top, the green circle is where a fisherman heard the screams of Brian Hartnell and Cecilia and went and reported it to the park ranger and the sheriff's department. Now, Dr. R. Clifton Rayfield and his teenage son David Rayfield might have actually saw the Zodiac killer walking away from the crime. And this doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, in my opinion. But David recalls, I saw Zodiac at a distance of about 100 yards, so I wouldn't be able to comment on his face. He was walking along the hillside about halfway between the road and the lake. But I remember him as being a stockier person. He wasn't nimble when he was walking, and when he turned to walk away, he wasn't like a smooth, athletic person. To me, he seemed a little overweight and on the clumsier side. Not having followed the story or even having been re-interviewed by the police, I didn't realize Zodiac came upon us just before he stabbed the young couple. I sort of assumed I saw him making his getaway. I'll tell you one thing, he didn't like the fact that I was carrying a gun. Here's an old crime scene photograph of the murder of a really good person. Paul Stein was a college student, newly married, and working nights driving a taxi cab to make a living when he was shot in the back of the head by the Zodiac killer. On Saturday night, Paul Stein was in the theater district when he received a dispatch for a cab ride on the west side of San Francisco. And then a man asked Paul Stein for a ride and told him he wanted to go to Washington and Maple Streets. And since that was on his way to the fair that he had to go to, he decided to give the man a ride that night. Now at Dr. Edward D. Robbins' house at about 9:50 p.m., his 3 children, Lindsay, Rebecca, and Trevor, one of them, 2 of them, or all 3 of them, witnessed something strange. They saw the man doing something to the taxi cab driver, which turned out to be the Zodiac cutting the back of the shirt off of Paul Stein after he had shot him. And then the Zodiac killer got out of the taxi, went around the front of the vehicle, went to the driver's side and opened the door and started wiping down the taxi cab with some kind of rag or something. And then after he did that, he went left, which was west, and then he turned right on Cherry Street and headed towards the Presidio. And then one of the teenagers called the San Francisco police at 9:58 p.m. And then there was a radio dispatch, and then the police were on their way. The first police officers arrived within minutes, and they met Sidney on the street, and he said the man went that way, north on Cherry. And so Presetti went in that direction, but he went slowly because he didn't want to get shot. And so he went down the street, and then he made a right on Jackson Street. Now, about a minute earlier, another patrol unit was driving north, and when they got a dispatch that a black man had shot a taxi cab driver, they had already passed over Washington Street, and so they made a left on Jackson Street and headed west towards the crime scene. And as they were driving, when they got to Maple and Jackson, Officer Folk saw a man, the Zodiac killer, and he either said some words to him or he didn't. He just looked at him, and then they continued on and drove to Cherry and then turned left and then went to the crime scene. And only later did he find out that the suspect was a white man. And then on Sunday or Monday, one of the teenagers worked with a police sketch artist, and they made this drawing, the one on the left. And then later it was amended to one on the right after Officer Folk came forward about crossing paths with the Zodiac killer that night, where he provided a scratch about the suspect, describing him as between 35 and 45 years old, about 5'10", between 180 and 200 pounds, medium to heavy build, barrel-chested, with a medium complexion. On Monday morning, the Zodiac mailed this letter.
This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington and Maple last night. To prove this, here is a blood-stained piece of his shirt.
Well, up until the attack on Brian and Cecilia at Lake Berryessa, you wouldn't have realized that the Zodiac killer was so organized. But you can see that he planned out that attack because he made that hood with the design on the front. He cut the clothesline, and he obviously planned that he was going to tie them up and then stab them with his knife, and then go and write on Brian's car door, and then go to Napa and make the phone call to the police. So you have to consider that the other crimes were more planned than they appeared. For example, the Zodiac used a different weapon in each crime, and he attached a small flashlight onto his gun. So he might have prepared way more for these first attacks. And then with Paul Stine, he cut off a piece of his shirt, knowing that he was going to write a letter to the paper, and he wanted to include the piece of the shirt to prove that he was the one that killed Paul Stine. In this chart of an organized crime scene, it says the body is hidden, but I don't think he ever planned to hide the bodies. He didn't plan to get caught. It states the victim is specifically targeted and restraints are often used. We don't know if the Zodiac targeted those individuals specifically, but they appear to be all young people, younger than the Zodiac, and he did kind of use restraints on them. They were all kind of trapped in their car, and they couldn't do anything but suffer the consequences of the Zodiac killer. Now you can see that the Zodiac killer wasn't a sexual predator, and he didn't even mention anything like that in his letters, but he was definitely a predator, a hunter. Like the movie Predator, he appeared on this earth to kill. He was the master hunter, and he referred to this movie and short story, The Most Dangerous Game, where this man is a revered hunter, and he has all these stories of killing these apex predators like cougars and lions and tigers from all over the world, but he's not satisfied killing them anymore. He wants the most dangerous game, a human being that he feels might be able to outsmart him or challenge him to his superiority. Now, I don't believe that the Zodiac killer was a collector, that he kept things from his victims so he could remember back to the crime. But I can see a counter-argument to my opinion. For example, David Faraday seemed to have his class ring in the tips of the ring and middle fingers of his left hand when he was found shot out there in the turnout. And then Paul Stine, his shirt was cut and taken, and I believe a few other things, the taxi cab keys and his wallet. But my opinion is he did this to prove that he killed Paul Stine, not to keep these items for his personal pleasure. I believe the Zodiac killer had a death wish, in the sense that he didn't care if he got caught, and he had given up on life. And the actions that he took were highly risky. Lake Herman Road is a well-traveled road, and it was a Friday night. And you can see from the facts, there were several cars and people out there on the road that night. It's often given the impression that this was some road to nowhere. No, that is not true. And then at Blue Rock Springs, it was the 4th of July. There were people out all about. And the Zodiac killer was nearly caught in that crime because the policeman was out there before the crime happened, and then George Bryant called the police immediately. But they didn't act on that because it was just gunfire, and it was the 4th of July. But when they got the report of a shooting, they immediately got there. And then at Lake Berryessa, the stabbing occurred a quarter mile away from the roadside. So the Zodiac parked his car out there. So even today, I don't understand why no one saw his car out there behind Brian Hartnell's car. But he walked the quarter mile and then did the stabbing and then walked back to his car and wrote on Brian Hartnell's car. This is very risky in the sense of being caught in the act. Now regarding the moon, on December 20th, 1968, it was dark, no moon. So it was just like the Zodiac said. And then on July 4th, 1969, it was almost a full, complete moon. And then on September 27th, 1969, it was a full moon. And then on October 11th, 1969, there was no moon out. So it would have been dark except for the fact that there were street lights. Well, this ends this episode, the longest episode yet. And we'll see you next weekend. And there's some bonus content at the end of this video if you want to watch that also. Now, Sergeant Pierre Badeau, talking about this in the documentary, This is the Zodiac speaking, recalled a drug bust that was conducted out there. And he said that he did not see any cars out there that evening. But the question is, where was the drug bust? There are some houses or cottages by Lake Herman Recreation Area. Here's one here. And that could be where the drug bust occurred. But then east of the crime scene, there's a building out in the field called the Zodiac Shack. And that could have been the location where the drug bust occurred. And if he was out there, he and the other police officers conducting the drug bust would have been east of the crime scene. And so he might not have saw any vehicles out there that night.